The very opening lines of the entire Bible are this: in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void, and the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. Before God said, "Let there be light," before God created us in his image, before God calls anything good, there is the Spirit of God hovering over the waters. At the very beginning of the New Testament, we find the Holy Spirit coming upon Mary and enabling her to bear the child Jesus into the world. At the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, we find the Holy Spirit descending on him like a dove. At the end of Jesus' ministry, he's sitting down with his disciples and he's telling them, "I'm going to leave you, but I'm going to send you a comforter, a Holy Spirit. And this Holy Spirit is going to live inside of you." And then in the book of Acts and in the writings of Paul, we find these glimpses of a church that their engine is running on something like rocket fuel. I mean, they're doing these incredible, amazing, mind-blowing things. They are not just changing the church for the next 2,000 years. They're literally changing the course of human history. Simple people, fishermen, tax collectors, just simple people doing amazing things because they have this power of the Spirit. So all of that begs the question, if the Holy Spirit sort of saturates the story of the Scriptures, if the Holy Spirit saturates the story of the early church, why don't we focus on the Holy Spirit, like, at all? Why is the Holy Spirit like the ugly stepchild of the Holy Trinity? In Francis Chan's book on the Holy Spirit called Forgotten God, he writes this: "But what if you grew up on a desert island with nothing but the Bible to read? Imagine being rescued after 20 years and then attending a typical church. Chances are you'd be shocked for a whole lot of reasons, but that is another story. Having read the Scriptures outside the context of contemporary church culture, you would be convinced that the Holy Spirit is as essential to a believer's existence as air is to staying alive." So where's the Spirit? Where's this air that we need to stay alive? Where is this rocket fuel that our foremothers and our forefathers had? So I think there are some reasons why we are reticent to focus on the Holy Spirit, and at least a couple of them I think are kind of historical, theological reasons. The first is that the earliest centuries of the church, like for almost 300 years, the church was an illegal religion. It was an underground institution. It was illegal to practice Christianity, to gather as Christians within the Roman Empire. And they weren't always being persecuted, but the threat of persecution was always there. Whoever happened to land on the throne of the Roman Empire could declare another persecution. They could go out and capture Christians, torture them, and kill them. And so for 300 years, the church is underground. And then Emperor Constantine makes Christianity legal. And all these Christian communities all over the Mediterranean basin start popping their heads up above water and looking at each other and then talking with each other. And when they do this, they end up realizing that because they were so isolated for so long, that they believe different things. I mean, some of these communities around the Mediterranean basin believed strangely different things from each other. And so they realized they needed to sort of come together on one page about at least the core beliefs of their faith. The first thing that they end up dealing with, and it's a good question, a big question, is who's Jesus? For some of them, Jesus was just a swell guy who God sort of made a wonder-working holy man, a prophet, but nothing more. To some, Jesus was fully God, total God, but not man at all. In fact, they believed that he was almost like a hologram, a trick of the eye. That if you saw him, he looked human, but he wasn't human at all. Some people said that he was adopted by God. He was a human being, but then sort of lifted up to this higher divine office than the rest of us. Some of them said that he was God, but not totally God. Like there's God the Father, and then there's God the Son down here, sort of like in a hierarchy. God the Father's above God the Son. And then there were others that said, no, Jesus is God in every way that he could be God. Every way that God the Father is God is the exact same way that God the Son is God. And after arguing about this, after thinking about it, after studying about it, after praying about it, the church ends up coming to basic agreement on the last position. They say Jesus is God in every way that God is God. And they also say that he's fully God and fully human at the same time. It's not a trick of the eye. He's not a hologram. He's not just a swell guy. He's not a prophet. He is God, but in the flesh. Now, after figuring that out, after taking almost 100 years to nail this question down, the church could have said, okay, we know who God the Father is, at least we think we do. We now know what we believe about God the Son, about Jesus. We could spend the next 100 years talking about, thinking about, studying about, praying about, arguing about the Holy Spirit. Except the church doesn't do that. Very quickly, the church says, okay, everything we said about Jesus being God in every way that God is, we're going to copy that and we're going to paste that under the Holy Spirit. And so, yep, the Holy Spirit is God in every way that Jesus is, everywhere that God the Father is. The Holy Spirit is God. And then they spend the better part of the next 100 years figuring out the Trinity, how God is one and how God is three at the same time. A great question to think about, to study about, to argue about, to pray about. But I wonder if the church had spent the same time, if they said, we're going to spend 100 years figuring out who the Holy Spirit is, I wonder if that would have created a church that wouldn't have been able to dismiss the Holy Spirit as much as subsequent generations of the church did. If the church had that kind of a theological foundation of the Holy Spirit and that sort of investment in the Spirit, I just think it would have been less likely for the Holy Spirit to have been forgotten. But it didn't happen. The other historical thing, theological thing that ends up happening is early on, there's these people that say, we're filled with the Holy Spirit. We got the Spirit. But they didn't. In fact, they were charlatans. They were like snake oil salesmen. There's an early church document called the Didache, or the Teaching of the 12 Apostles. And it very well could be a late first century document. It could be contemporaneous with the rest of the New Testament. We don't really know. But we do know that it's early. And here's one of the things that the Didache says. Not everybody making ecstatic utterances is a prophet. If someone says in the Spirit, give me money or something else, you must not heed him. In the 2nd century, there was this other group called the pneumatikoi. In Greek, the word pneuma means spirit. As we'll see in subsequent episodes of this series, the concept of spirit and breath are deeply linked, not just in the Greek language, but in other languages as well. These pneumatikoi were the ones with the Spirit, and these were not like the first ones who claimed to have the Spirit. These weren't necessarily charlatans. I think these were like true believers. They believed what they were saying. It's just that they would come to town and say, oh, it's really nice that you all have the Bible. You all have the scriptures. You all have these writings of the teachings of Jesus. It's really nice that you all have these bishops and these elders and these leaders in your churches, but we have the Holy Spirit. We have this direct conduit to God. So we don't need the scriptures. We don't need the writings of Jesus. And we certainly don't need the bishops with their pointy hats. We just got the Spirit. And that might have been okay. That might have flown if the pneumaticoi didn't teach things that were wildly against the scriptures, wildly opposed to the teachings of Jesus, and wildly opposed to the bishops. And so the early church had to suppress them. And in so doing, I don't think it's crazy to think that in suppressing a movement of people who claimed to have the Holy Spirit, that they wouldn't also end up casting suspicion on the Spirit itself. If all of a sudden anyone that says that we have the Spirit is then suspect, and the Holy Spirit isn't enough because you need the Spirit and you need the scriptures and the teachings of Jesus and the teachings of the church and et cetera, et cetera. I don't know this for sure, but it's my hunch that these movements, which sort of abused the Spirit, ended up demoting the Spirit for future generations. I've been giving sermons for almost 20 years now. And even when I'm preaching in the Old Testament, I'm preaching about Moses or I'm preaching about Ezekiel or Isaiah or something, I am still very aware and cognizant that I am a Christian preacher. And so in my sermon, I am very aware that I need to also talk about Jesus, talk about Moses, and then what does Jesus say, or how does Jesus fit into this? I'll be very honest with you. I don't feel the same pressure to constantly talk about the Holy Spirit. Whereas I feel like I have to mention Jesus in every sermon. I don't always do that with the Holy Spirit. The church itself, we have all these feasts and festivals that surround the life and the ministry and the death and the resurrection of Jesus, chief among them being Christmas and Easter, his birth and his resurrection. But we have one Sunday of the church year dedicated to the Holy Spirit, and that's the day of Pentecost. And there's other things going on in Pentecost than even just the Spirit. And so, you know, you could go, if you miss church on Pentecost, you might not hear about the Spirit for years. There's a scene in Acts chapter 19 where Paul goes to the church in Ephesus. And he's in this church, and he's looking around at them. And they're believers, they believe in Jesus, they love Jesus. But there's just something missing. You know, they just don't seem to have the same rocket fuel that all the other communities have. And so Paul asks them, just point blank, he says, "Did you receive the Holy Spirit?" They answered, "No, we have not even heard that there is a Holy Spirit." And of course, after this, Paul prays that they would receive the Spirit. And then they get the same rocket fuel that all the other churches have, and they're off and running. Do you notice any similarities between this church in Ephesus 2,000 years ago and us today? I mean, how many people, if you went up to them in a pew and you said, "Do you have the Holy Spirit? Have you received the Holy Spirit?" How many of them would look at you like you have 4 heads attached to your shoulder? Like, what? What are you talking about? Over the next few sessions of third person, this course on the Holy Spirit. We're going to be looking at the Holy Spirit in the Hebrew Bible, the Holy Spirit in the Gospels, the Holy Spirit in Acts, the Holy Spirit in the Epistles, the Holy Spirit in the stories of the ancient and not so ancient church. But the point of this course isn't just to teach you interesting things about the Holy Spirit, but it's to encourage you to begin a relationship with the Holy Spirit. And one of the first ways that you can do this is by praying an ancient prayer, a prayer that we don't even know how old it is, but it may go back to some of the earliest days of the church. In Latin, the prayer is Veni Sancte Spiritus. In English, Come, Holy Spirit. And that's it. Just 3 words. Come, Holy Spirit. You could put yourself in a receiving posture. If that feels weird to you, you don't have to do it, but you might want to do it, particularly if you're alone at home and no one's watching you. And you just pray, Come, Holy Spirit. Inviting the Spirit into your heart, into your mind, into your life, into your spiritual life. This invitation will also hopefully heighten your awareness of the Spirit around you. In the same ways that you might think about God the Father and imagine God the Father being around us. And you might think about Jesus and what he looked like 2,000 years ago and what he looks like in your life today. In those same ways, you might be able to conjure up images and awareness of the presence of the Holy Spirit around you, and as Jesus says, within us. Remember the words of Francis Chan, the Holy Spirit is as essential to a believer's existence as air is to staying alive.